Lord Mayor of Dublin, Councillor Hazel, colleagues, friends. On behalf of the Royal Irish Academy, it gives me great pleasure to welcome you to today's event, Post-Pandemic Housing Transformation and the Value of Home. My name is Anya Hyland. I'm a member of the Royal Irish Academy and chair of its Social Sciences Committee, which is organising this event in collaboration with the sponsor, Dublin City Council. The Royal Irish Academy was established in 1785 and is an all-island, independent body of peer-elected experts from the sciences, humanities and social sciences. I would like to welcome you all virtually to the Royal Irish Academy, and I would especially like to welcome our keynote speaker, Professor Susan Smith from the University of Cambridge, our respondent, Professor Manuel Aalbers of KU Leuven, and our esteemed panel discussants, Professor Mary Murphy of Maynooth University and Associate Professor Declan Redmond of University College Dublin. I would also like to thank my colleague on the Social Sciences Committee, Dr. Dahi Downey from the Housing and Community Services Department of Dublin City Council, and Pauline McNamara from the Royal Irish Academy for planning and organising this conference. This is a timely discussion given the ongoing pressures on housing to provide a place of home for all in our society. Planning for housing is one of the most basic functions of economic and social policy in any country. The COVID-19 pandemic will increase demand for social and affordable housing over the medium and long term, and most OECD countries, including Ireland, are ill-equipped to meet these needs because of steep reductions in public housing construction. This comes at a time when the world's wealthiest nations have halved public investment in housing development over the past 20 years. We look forward to hearing today's speakers and to engaging in the discussion on this very important topic. I would like to thank our partner and sponsor of this event, Dublin City Council, and I'm delighted to welcome the Lord Mayor of Dublin, Councillor Hazel, to formally open the conference.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I am Hazel Chu, Lord Mayor of Dublin. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you all to today's live webinar from here in Ireland's premier academic institute, the Royal Irish Academy. Dublin City Council is the sponsor of today's webinar, and before we begin, I want to take a few minutes with you to consider the issue of housing in our city. Firstly, I want to note the importance, and not just of the subject area of housing, but of the extremely relevant and topical issue of housing transformation in our post-pandemic society. The impact of COVID-19 pandemic has brought dramatic changes in how we live, work, and play. The normal conditions and structures of our society have been upended. Today, the importance of place to how we live as households and neighbours, and how we form and sustain ourselves as communities, is ever more critical. The reconfiguration of how we live is well underway. Remote working from home and changes in our patterns of commuting and retailing will likely extend into the near future. But the prospect of post-pandemic society is closer now than heretofore. This is due to the extraordinary degree of collaboration and joint effort among our scientific and research communities who shared their expertise and knowledge to bring forward vaccinations to the COVID-19 virus. Knowledge is at the very heart of understanding. Today, we will hear a keynote address from Professor Susan Smith, a leading public intellectual academic and geographer from the University of Cambridge. Professor Smith will reflect on how the COVID-19 pandemic has impacted on our lived experience of housing and home in ways that will surely have profound and lasting effects. She will draw our attention to a powerful call to action, the near prospect of a post-pandemic world, and the possibility, necessity, and appeal of positioning housing at the centre of that recovery. She brings a focus of the imagination, policies and practices required to transform the inclusivity, sustainability and well-being of neighbourhoods and communities. And I very much look forward to her contribution. She will be responded to by Professor Manuel Aalbers from Leuven, University, Belgium. Thereafter, we will be introduced to two more speakers, Professor Mary Murphy from Maynooth University and Associate Professor Declan Redmond from University College Dublin, both of whom will bring the local perspective of promises to be a very lively follow-on discussion, reflection on how our values of home relate to a new moral economy of housing. Our moderator throughout today's webinar is Professor Ken Gibb of the University of Glasgow. Professor Gibb is also chair of the advisory board to Dublin City Council's Housing Observatory. So I think it's appropriate for me to say a final few words now on housing in Dublin. Every day, city staff engage in the design, production, management and maintenance of places to live, work and play in Dublin. And learning from our daily experience is vital. The City Council has also just concluded the phase of consultation on details of our next city development plan from 2022. We will continue to engage successfully with all our stakeholders, including all our elected local representatives, our strategic policy committees, our local and community development committee, local regeneration forums and project implementation boards, our business and enterprise sector, among many, many others. Because how we develop our housing strategy is a core element of the new city development plan. There are many important changes to meet here. But at the heart of our next housing strategy, I feel we must bring an emphasis on healthy placemaking for communities. We must ensure we transition to more sustainable and affordable quality neighbourhoods where we make our homes. I want Dublin to bring forward new and innovative proposals for social and affordable housing that delivers on the importance of place, quality and community development. We need housing that helps deliver better integration and is accompanied by increased quality, affordable city living and greater tenure of choice. This must be realised under this government's commitments to prioritise the increased supply of public, social and affordable homes, with an emphasis on new builds that puts affordability at the heart of the housing system and tackles homelessness. This effort must also combine with commitments to delivery of a home renovation model capable of driving improvements in the energy efficiency of our homes, reducing carbon emissions and tackling energy poverty. As we proceed towards our post-pandemic society, I am confident that Dublin City's emphasis will continue to focus on the delivery of high-quality places to live. Places to live that return the greatest value to our new and our existing communities with regard to meeting and sustaining them in healthy, socially rich and economically productive lifestyles that touch lightly on the environment. In response to this defining moment, I can clearly state Dublin City is committed to actions that can deliver a better quality life for all, equality within society and a deeper sense of connection to the natural world around us and each other. We have already begun to address this enormous and inspiring challenge. We bring an emphasis on how place quality works to influence the lives we live, the opportunities available to us for personal and communal happiness, our identity and our sense of belonging as community. Today's webinar is another example of our commitment in Dublin to continue to be at the forefront of the delivery of this new housing agenda. I hope you enjoy what promises to be a very stimulating and highly relevant webinar this afternoon. Thank you and enjoy.
Good afternoon. I'd like to start by thanking Anya Hyland from the Royal Irish Academy and Lord Mayor Hazel for their wonderful welcomes and introductions today. My name's Ken Gibb. I'm a professor at the University of Glasgow, where I direct the UK Collaborative Centre for Housing Evidence. And I'm delighted to be here to be your chair for what should be a really exciting afternoon's debate and discussion. I'm going to do three things in this introduction. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the topic, or my understanding of what our topic's about today. I'm going to run through the order of proceedings, and then I'm going to introduce our keynote speaker. So the topic today is about the post-pandemic housing transformation and the value of home, and I think we can split that rather interesting phrase for the title into those three component parts. Post-pandemic, we have an uncertain route out of the COVID-19 pandemic. We are a little bit uncertain about the timings of all of those things, and each country, of course, is responding in different ways to how the crisis has unfolded. We don't know, for instance, to what extent our economies will take some time to recover, and what the extent of the social damage wrought by the crisis will actually be. But as we move out of that crisis, many writers, governments, agencies have discussed the notion of potentially new ways of thinking about how we organise our lives, how governments operate, how policy gets made, who is it for, etc. So it's maybe not surprising that we think about housing transformation being a part of that process. And I think some of the questions we might think about as we ponder that this afternoon is really the sense of whether this is a period of regime change, a possibility of regime change, where a major new route or a set of new routes can emerge. What might they be like? Will they, and to what extent, will they reflect or reinforce existing long-term trends or emerging patterns that we see? How will behaviour respond to these things? What will it mean for our communities, our places, our society, our financial systems, etc.? And I think we also have this phrase, value of home, which of course is, I think, deliberately ambivalent. It can mean a number of different things. Are we talking about the investment, speculative value of housing? Are we talking about home as a consumption shelter activity fundamentally? Are we considering the ways in which values may shift as a result of the crisis and our responses, and as we try to recover from it? There's much to think about there. And I think also we obviously mustn't, although we have a very international kind of set of presentations today, we mustn't lose sight of the fact that we are in Ireland and Dublin, and that Ireland itself faces considerable housing challenges, and indeed two of our speakers are going to play a significant role in that. So very quickly, we're going to, after I finish speaking, our keynote speaker will speak for about half an hour, and will be followed by a formal discussant, which will last about 15 minutes, and that will leave us with an hour, which will form a kind of roundtable discussion. We will have an additional two speakers to join that roundtable. I'm not going to introduce any of them just yet. I will stick to introducing our keynote speaker today, and then hand over to her. So we're delighted that we have Professor Susan Smith, a Professor of Geography and the Mistress of Girton College at the University of Cambridge, who's going to speak to us today. I've known Susan for many years. We were actually at the University of Glasgow together, and she even was the chair of my first ever jobs interview panel, so she is responsible for a lot of things, as well as the excellent internationally renowned scholarly work that she's so associated with in the fields of inequality, in housing and mortgages and housing wealth, and many, many more things. So I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Susan along today, and I look very much forward to what she has to say. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much for that generous introduction from everyone, actually, and for the huge privilege of being invited to speak here today. I'm very honoured to be with you. And also thank you, all of you, for being here. It's Friday afternoon on a screen, and I'm sure there's a lot to compete. But anyway, here we are. And post-pandemic housing transformations. I don't think I've ever been asked before to speak on such a big topic like, the whole future. So I've decided to call this glimpse forward a provocation. 6 little fragments of ideas, some of which I hope might capture your imagination. So hopefully I get a slide up here, which I can't in fact see on my screen. So I'm just, that's it, excellent. So 6 little fragments then to think about. First, it's very tempting, isn't it, to think of the present catastrophe as a kind of something that might at the very least offer the seed of something new, something we could grow from. Well, I'm afraid I don't think we can rely on it to kind of re-baseline the future. It's blown itself, this pandemic, into a perfect storm, whipped up by a turn to economic inequality that began 4 decades ago, as you can see from this slide. It's a visual from the World Inequality Database. I could have chosen one of, thousands really to show you this particular trend. It shows the share of all income from all sources accruing to the top 10%. I could have taken 1% or 0.1%. That share has been increasing steadily, albeit at different rates the world over. And here, just for your information, is a screenshot for Ireland, where by the mid-2000s, the top 10% in red are accruing around a third of all pre-tax income, and then the bottom 50% in blue, less and less, now around a fifth. And here's the stylized kind of U-shaped curve of inequality over the past whole century that so many countries of the more developed world have followed. It's a reminder that we went into the pandemic, if you look at the 2 ends of the curve, we went into the pandemic with levels of economic inequality that match those of the early 20th century, the world of Downton Abbey, Peaky Blinders, and so on. And also, there was a huge catastrophe, a huge dip of top incomes early in that century. The last time there was a turning point, it was prompted by the catastrophe of war and the proper unravelling of colonialism. So what shocks have we had? More recently, the shock of the global financial crisis, as you can see from the OECD's investigation, made rather little impact. Did top incomes and bottom incomes dipped, but it was followed by a round of business as usual when top incomes recovered and others didn't. And while the pandemic is altogether a different kind of crisis, if we look at Oxfam's recent report, based on a survey of 295 economists from 79 countries, we have little grounds for optimism that the pandemic is somehow going to reset and we can build from that base. Most economists seem to think, that the present regime of inequality is here to stay if things go on as they are. So the point is there's nothing naturally transformational, I think, built into the present crisis. So if housing is going to play a part, it's a very big ask. So to my second thought, the one thing the pandemic has done for housing is foreground its use value. In fact, you could say that housing has become overburdened by use and its use values over the past year. It's had to gather up the entire public sphere: work, furlough, holidays, exercise, children's education, higher education, and a bundle of new technologies, all for starters. There's a lot more use packed into housing today than there was this time last year. Now, I know that many of you are keen to discuss the implications of this for urban and housing design, the future of smart homes in smart cities, sustainability benchmarks. Can homes absorb the changing world of work in an energy efficient way? And I hope and I'm confident that we will talk about that a little bit later on. But I'm using this graphic because I think housing has a much more fundamental use value than any of the others that have crowded into it recently. These pandemic tropes, the kind we get in this slide, are an important reminder, aren't they, of civic duty, and I'm fully bought into that. But they do spark critique. Staying home presumes you have one, and staying home presumes you're safe there, which of course we know that sadly many people aren't. And this one, it's the British government, stay home, protect the NHS, save lives. It reminds me on the one hand of the importance of protecting essential services that are collectively provided on the basis of needs. I mean, I love it for that. But there's also a kind of unsettling hint here that even as all those important public sphere activities are spilling out of the back bedroom across the entire domestic landscape, the care work that is fundamental to the use value of home, that the use of home is kind of anchored on, is going on elsewhere. I don't want to make too much of that, but I do want to return later to this notion that the ethic of care preserved in a few key public services is in fact a fundamental use value in housing and home. It has a sharp political edge as well, if we decide to use it. In the meantime, my third little provocation is about the disconnect between the use values of housing and the exchange values that Ken alluded to earlier, the soaring costs of buying into them. Now, here's another graphic amongst, again, thousands that could illustrate this point. It's a global house price index baselined to 1980, and you can see how it's grown over the years that the turn to inequality that I showed earlier followed. It reflects the extent to which, in fact, through the turn to inequality, there's been also a process that we would call capital switching into land. That is to say, prices have soared, not because housing supports more services or meets more needs necessarily, but because the land it stands on has become an increasingly attractive investment. In this slide, there's a few commentators on that, just to give you a sense of just how important residential property has become in the world of investment. You can read them if you like at your leisure, but Manuel Aalbers is on the call and he'll be talking in a few minutes, and you might be pleased to know that his quote is the one I usually use to sum this up. The present day value of real estate in relation to the overall stock of capital and of income is truly without historical precedent. Now, for owner-occupiers, the dominant tenure sector who got onto the escalator early enough, this turn was helpful in a number of ways, not least because they could borrow against those rising home values to supplement incomes that were stagnating through that whole turn to inequality. But the fact is today that even, and perhaps especially, the dominant and popular tenure type owner occupation is becoming too expensive to be useful. And that's why so many colleagues are starting to describe it in terms that suggest it's floundering. Phrases like the false promise that it should be inclusive and equalising and secure. It should be inclusive, equalising and secure, and it's the opposite. The myth of home ownership, the contradictions built into it. In fact, a lot of us are returning to a much older argument about the damaging trade-off whole economies and societies have made between putting all our eggs into the basket of individual home ownership and supporting collectively funded welfare. This brings me then towards a fourth provocation. Will post-pandemic housing transformations inevitably be about post-home ownership? Well, de facto, the drift is yes. This is a graphic that comes from actually an Australian Research Council funded project on the edges of ownership, led by Rachel Ong in Perth, with several colleagues who are listed at the end. The data in the graphs are from the national panel surveys of the UK, the USA and Australia between 2001 and 2017. And of course, they return to the same households every year. So you could kind of start to see what's happening as the years unfold. And I think it's pretty clear to see what's happening from these slides. Ownership rates in all these societies have fallen gradually over time, but especially among the young. In fact, if you look closely at these graphs, you'll see that only around a third of 25 to 34-year-olds in any jurisdiction, even less in the USA, had attained owner occupation by 2017. There's a drop-off at the older end of the age group as well, which is something we might talk about. But more generally, what we see from these data, and I'm sure you could collect data from many other jurisdictions as well, more generally, for the first time in 50 years, a growing proportion of households hold no property wealth at all. Well, what are they doing instead? As you know, all the talk is about generation rent, or more critically, about a new generation of rentier. Now, Manuel Aalbers might speak to this, but to me, the direction of travel, it doesn't feel too transformational. First, for example, we saw an increase in multiple property ownership, that kind of huge raft of buy-to-let landlords chasing capital gains, sometimes buying to leave, but certainly adding to an already widening housing wealth divide. Now, I'm not passing judgment on individuals here. There's a lot of reasons why it made sense, and it makes sense for people to go into that area, but it's an unequalising force overall. Then we saw a similar kind of quick get-rich-quick motivation driving a round of institutional investments into the private rental sector by things like private equity firms, hedge funds, and so on. And these now seem to have given way in recent years to the owners of what people are calling patient capital, real estate investments trusts, listed real estate companies, and so on, who are invested for the long term, looking for rental return as well as capital gains, but they're highly acquisitive and not very forgiving in the setting of rents. Now, the jury's a bit out on some of this. It is possible that the professionalisation of private renting and the long view of real estate investors will work in some ways for tenants in terms of security of tenure, quality of accommodation, and affordability, and so on. But on balance, I find this hoovering up of property by a few big ticket organisations really quite worrying. The process has only achieved scale because owner-occupiers are no longer blocking access to the majority of the housing stock, and it's taking what little wealth ordinary people once had out of their portfolios and into the private domain of international finance. Actually, you know, it's starting to feel like we're tilting towards those 19th century settings where the majority rented their homes and owned rather little else. So, are there any post-pandemic housing transformations that might in fact be transformative? Is there anything that could perhaps challenge rather than reinforce the current regime? Well, quite a few practical agendas are starting to come through. I particularly like Gertjan Wijberg's definancialisation manifesto. He's trying to get us to think about how practically to detach housing from those circuits of capital that have mired it in debt and made it unaffordable. But for my take on this challenge, my fifth provocation, I want to try and kind of, I don't know, let our imaginations run a little bit wild. The mundane but crucial world of tax, which is where I'm going to start. The mundane but crucial world of tax might not be the obvious starting point. But property and land taxes, we know they're irrational, we know they're regressive, and we know they're long overdue for reform, whether we're thinking about imputed incomes and taxes on those, land value taxes, taxes on capital gains, and so on. And I really like the way that Thomas Piketty tackles this in his latest big book. Here he's talking about the case for what he calls participatory socialism. But his argument is quite a nice one. It's quite an attractive one. You know, it's kind of one that I think could sort of change our way of thinking. And he's arguing that because private wealth accumulates through public infrastructures, through the whole history and geography of who the public have been over the years, then some part of it and all of its profits are social products, and they should be shared via progressive taxation. He's really interested in the progressive taxation of wealth, and that wealth, therefore, he argues, is only temporarily owned. And I really like this idea of temporary ownership. Now, materially, even without any new concepts and ideas, I must say that a more rational, progressive system of taxation could itself be transformational. I know it's not a very sort of engaging topic, but tax is absolutely crucial. And one of the things it could do is rebalance those use and exchange values around residential property that have so tipped the balance towards overinvestment and, if you like, an undervaluing of use. And at the same time as it does that, of course, it could raise funds, and those funds could be reinvested into the quality, the condition, and the management of the housing stock. So practically, it's a really good idea as well, but conceptually, I like it. Culturally, this kind of concept, this practice of temporary ownership, it could change the entire feel, in a way, and the experience of home occupation. It could make it feel more like home stewardship. It could sort of change our understanding and our experience of home occupation. It enlarges the housing imaginary. And I think once you kind of enlarge that imaginary and really believe that you can do something a little bit different, then you can start to work with some other potentially transformational ideas. And another one that I like a lot, and I think we could really talk about, is that institutionally, there may be much more to play for than we think. Institutionally, we probably have some very narrow spectacles on when we think about what's possible. And for that reason, I like this very thought-provoking piece by Ireland and Meng in Economy and Society. They published it a few years ago, but it draws attention to what they call the untapped range of institutional possibilities that open up when you start to prize apart the kind of unitary thing that we imagine property is. If we prize away the rights and entitlements bundled into property, if we tease them out and share them and reassemble them in different ways, then you've got a kind of post-capitalist thought experiment that could, for example, fracture our dualistic thinking about tenure into 1,000 tiny pieces. Now, this resonates with me for a number of reasons. And one of the reasons is that the Edges of Ownership project that I mentioned earlier, what we're doing there is tracking people moving into and dropping out of ownership. And as we were doing that, we found, in fact, there's a lot of people dropping in and out and in and out again of both owning and renting, much more than the conventional binary implies, even though the sector has been steadily shrinking. And we're really interested in this because there's a sort of level of churn, if you like, in the space between tenures, which has no visibility. I mean, who talks about it? No institutional base, and yet is really very central to some people's lived experience. So, you know, a lot of us are talking about tenure neutrality. And I think we've all known for many years that there shouldn't be differences between owning and renting that have to do with rights of occupancy or costs or financial rewards and so on. So where all these fundamentals of costs, security and tenure and all of that are concerned, we should certainly be talking about tenure neutrality. But I also like the idea of institutional experimentation. I like the idea of, if you like, 1,000 tiny tenure experiments for all kinds of reasons, partly because I think that new thinking comes out of diversity. New thinking very often comes from the bottom up, but also because it reminds me of the feminist Elizabeth Gross's conviction that the very best way to break down a binary, especially an uncomfortable one, especially an unworkable one, especially one that you've known for a long time shouldn't be present, is to liberate the diversity that is otherwise subsumed by a kind of either or mindset. Tapping into an underused range of institutional possibility could do all sorts of things to our thinking about the way housing is structured, financed, delivered, organised and managed. It offers a chance to kind of rearrange the basic infrastructure of housing in ways that we think are better and more appealing and more public spirited. And that brings me to the third kind of transformation that I'm interested in. Because I do tend to feel that as scholars, as academics, we spend a lot of time working out what we're against. You know, we can see what's gone wrong, can't we, over this last 40 or 50 years. We can see what's gone wrong after the last 10 years, and our journals are full of that critique. And of course, it's really important because without the critique, we can't go anywhere. But I also like to think a bit about not just what we're against, but also what we're for. So, you know, we're against financialisation, debt, binary divides. But what are we actually for? And this is where the vision of housing as an infrastructure of care, set out quite recently by Emma Power in Australia, in Sydney, and her colleagues, really piques my interest. It's a political project here. It's a bid to institute an ethic of care across whole housing systems. It's a bid to build an ethic of care into even the materiality, the structures, the organisation of homes. And it's a bid to manage and to operate and to use housing collaboratively and cooperatively to enable and to empower an ethic of care to be instituted and enjoyed. And perhaps it's the route to using housing interventions to empower from the inside out, if you like, whole societies to change, to harness some fundamental new values, or at least to rediscover some fundamental important values, the interdependence of human life, its altruism, the inherent reciprocity of all that we do, whether it's in housing or work, actually, the mutual responsibilities that everyone should engage in. Now, this vision of housing as imbued with, as harnessing, as embracing, and as bringing forward into wider society an ethic of care, those altruisms and mutual responsibilities, that's a long way, isn't it, from the vision rooted in our present system, particularly in the centrality of owner occupation as that individualized asset base for, good citizens who are self-insuring subjects to operate in this regime of inequality. It's a long way from that, but if those two visions are equally wild, then of course we need to pursue the one that is best. And that leads me to my sixth and last little provocation in this session. Because if the pandemic's not a catalyst for transformation, if that's not going to kind of re-baseline the future for us, well, what is? Well, actually, I think some of the people on this call will do that. People in leadership positions, people who've got vision, who can work with their organisations to change the future, to reimagine what's possible. Whole local governments can do different things. There are experiments in place all over the world, and we can share them and enact them. But also perhaps ordinary people. And this brings me to a last interesting thought. I mean, I don't know how many scholars on the call are actually old enough to remember these early works by Wrexham Moore and Peter Saunders. But there was this idea years ago that there was a kind of radical potential for housing movements to use housing to transform the way housing's delivered and also to change the world and make it a better place. Now, that radical potential of those housing movements, I think we can say, probably didn't materialise half a century ago. But the feeling today, and I've put a few quotes in there from some recent work, the feeling today is that given housing's position in the present regime of inequality, perhaps it could be a point of mobilisation. Perhaps it is the starting point for restructuring the future. Now, it's possible, of course, that the way that class structures are rethinking themselves or reworking themselves through housing will put different people in different housing positions against each other. You could draw that out of some of these quotes. But actually, my money is on a unifying alliance, an alliance forged among the majority of home occupiers whose interests all lie somewhere, I think, at the intersection of a bid for definancialisation and a yearning to embrace an ethics of care. So that's really my fragments. Those are my kind of 6 little imaginaries about the way the future about the way the past has been actually, and where the future might go. I've not got there a detailed blueprint for the next round of housing investment, though I'm happy to talk a little bit about some ideas about the future of property ownership and the way it might be shared and revalued for the future. But they do make the point, I think, that housing transformations could be, well, transformational. And to that end, as Courtney Pine once said, the limit is our own imagination. Thank you so much for listening to mine.
Thank you very much, Susan. That's fantastic. I feel thoroughly provoked now, which is what I think your objective, amongst others, certainly included. That's brilliant. I think there's so much food for thought there that I'm sure that will facilitate a lot of very interesting discussion. And we start that discussion with a response from Professor Manuel Aalbers from Leuven University in Belgium. Manuel is a very well-known and respected academic internationally, working on financialisation, the mortgage market, inequalities, and urban spatial dimensions, amongst many other things. A very well-known figure in contemporary academic research in our area. I've had the pleasure of working with Manuel in the past, and it's great to have him here today. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Manuel.
Okay, Ken, thanks a lot for that introduction. I don't know what went wrong in the sound, but I'm happy you can all hear me now. Pauline, thanks for organizing this, and the Royal Irish Academy for inviting me. And thanks a lot to Susan for an inspiring presentation, and also for sticking so well into time, as Ken just said. There was a lot of information in less than 25 minutes, which luckily gives us a few minutes to solve the microphone issues that apparently existed. So I've thanked all these people. I'm going to get to the content now. Let's see if the clicker works. Yes, it works. So early on, in the COVID pandemic, we heard a lot of stories about housing values that were about to go down in the big cities and that were going to go up in the countryside. I think this is not necessarily what we've seen in COVID. I think there are different experiences in different countries around the world, but of some of the cases I know, housing prices have been going up in both cities and in the countryside. So I think the whole idea about the city dying because people don't need to be there for work anymore reminds us a little bit about discussions in the past where people said like, oh, with all the new IT, people don't need to work in the city anymore. And what we've only seen in all these big changes, housing in the city becomes more expensive. Just the other day, a report was released for Belgian cities, and the prices in the cities have actually gone up more than in the countryside. Although select parts of the countryside, the prices have gone up more. In a way, there's more diversity in the countryside in the price developments than in the cities, it seems. But of course, there's a different story for renting a house or for owning a house. I think early on in the pandemic, many people, including myself, thought the prices would drop because unemployment rates would rise. But what we've actually seen is that many governments have had a lot of government programs to pop up home ownership. But the protection of tenants in many countries hasn't been on the same level of support. And I think that is part of the problem. At the same time, we've seen that in some places where prices do go up for houses, the rental prices do not necessarily go up. But again, there's quite some differences between places, and the impact on tenants, of course, if they lose their home, can be quite large as well. So I'll just give you a second to look at this little cartoon. Yeah, so this echoes one of the things that Susan was mentioning, which is that the fallout of home ownership has been quite selective for specific groups. Among older groups, this has not been much of a problem, especially not among middle class and upper class older groups, but among low income groups and especially among younger low income groups and younger groups more generally, also with less steady employment contracts, we see how ownership rates are dropping. They're not just stabilizing, they're significantly dropping. But what we see at the same time is that there's actually a lot of demand to buy rental units and to let them out. So we see the buy to let investors that we have read quite a bit about in the last 10 years or so. But I think another important class that sometimes gets a little bit less attention are corporate landlords. So we can think about real estate investment trust here, private equity funds, hedge funds. They are buying up housing quite massively. Together with Zach Taylor, a postdoc here in Leuven, we just started a small project where we look into what is happening with REITs who invest in housing, because many of them don't invest in housing but in offices or malls. But the ones that invest in housing, what we actually see is that they are expanding their investments during the COVID pandemic. So it's just the first hint. We're only just starting the research, but in a way what we see is that the COVID pandemic is increasing some of the trends that we've seen in the last years. Housing prices go up further. The difference between renting and owning becomes bigger. Buy to let becomes even bigger. A lot of people actually have a steady income. They can't spend their money on much. They can't go out to a restaurant. They can't go to the theater. They can't really go on a holiday. So people actually have more savings to put into housing. And what you see in this buy to let market. And the corporate landlords at the same time also get a lot of extra investments that allows them to buy up more housing. So yes, there is the story of home ownership going down, but of course, another part of the story is intergenerational transfers. That's also an important one. So I put this little speaking thing here at the bottom, which is my sort of the reference to the terms that Susan was using. So she had slides about post-home ownership with a question mark and housing transformations. I agree with Susan, it's not really post-home ownership yet. We're not there yet. But I think another interesting thing is a contradiction within the home ownership model. And I'm going to explain that a little bit more through the case of Belgium. Although I'm based in Belgium, I'm actually Dutch, and I haven't worked much on housing in Belgium, but last year I did publish a paper with a former student, Ellen Fixen. So I'm not speaking about Belgium because I'm based here. I actually know much more about housing in the Netherlands or the US or even Italy. But I think the story of Belgium is actually quite similar to the story of Ireland. So the Irish people on the panel can tell me later on if they recognize some of these things, and I look forward to hear from them. So we hear a lot in the English language literature, which is mostly UK, US, and to some extent Australia, about home ownership being a dominant ideology. And this is very often a story about the post-Second World War. In the case of the US, maybe a little bit earlier also. But I think if we look at a case like Belgium or Ireland, we see that the home ownership ideology is already dominant much earlier. Already in 1898, there is a law in Belgium that puts home ownership forward as the preferred tenure. Another interesting parallel between Belgium and Ireland is this dominance of Catholic thought. So the Rerum Novarum and the Quadragesimo Anno, two writings of Catholic thought, they already neutralize private property rights quite strongly. And in the Belgian policy debate of the late 19th century and early 20th century, you can already see how this Catholic thinking is feeding into discourses about housing, especially discourses about home ownership, and also how home ownership is being regulated, both in formal ways and in informal ways. And then we see that once this is established, new political parties, but also different class alliances, other new powerful actors in Belgium are not really questioning this ideology. They're not destabilizing or denormalizing this ideology. And the idea of asset-based welfare that becomes quite popular in English-speaking countries since the 1980s. If we actually look at the whole history of Belgium, the word asset-based welfare didn't exist either in Dutch or in French. But if you go back more than a century, you can already see what we now call asset-based welfare was already the policy in Belgium for a long time. And I know someone like Michel Norris, for instance, has argued something similar for Ireland. So I think that is quite interesting as well, that this asset-based welfare predates, in a way, the coining of the concept. Another important element here of the home ownership policy in Belgium is that it comes along with relatively limited zoning or planning. In a way, you can build anywhere unless otherwise specified. And even then, in some cases, you can still build. Self-building up till 20 years ago was the dominant form of house building in Belgium, like we see in Southern Europe and like we see, for instance, in many developing countries. There's an expression in Belgium that says that Belgians are born with a stomach in their, with a brick in their stomach, suggesting that that brick needs to come out and they need to start building their own house. They do this with family support in the terms of labor, but also in terms of financial support from families. So this whole story that we hear now very often, especially coming quite dominantly from the UK, about family support becoming more important, especially in financial terms, for Belgians, this is an old story. And as far as I know, also for Ireland, this has a much longer history. Government subsidies, of course, have always been used for decades to support home ownership, not just for middle and high-income people, also for working class people. Social renting sector at the same time is underdeveloped, is somewhat stigmatized and often not very well maintained. Private renting does exist, especially in the larger cities, but it's not very well regulated. It's not always in the best condition, and therefore is quite a poor alternative to many people. So the ideal was and is owning a home, but the idea was always about owning the home outright. That is, really owning it, not renting from the bank, as people sometimes say when you have a mortgage loan. So what we see, what happened in the last few decades, is that we moved into a situation where people still have all these ideas about home ownership that have to do with owning the house outright. But in practice, most people now need a mortgage loan to do this. So what we see as a result of this is that we find a really big contradiction. And this has to do with what Susan calls the foundering of owner occupation. And for a moment, I was wondering if she meant the floundering of owner occupation or the foundering, but actually it might be both. But I'm not a native speaker here, so there's other people who might have interesting thoughts about if it's the foundering or floundering of owner occupation. But we see a really big contradiction between the nature of these discourses that support home ownership, which I won't be able to discuss in detail here, but they establish home ownership as the normalized form of tenure in Belgium. But then the reality of financialized home ownership is actually declining affordability, as we see in countries around the world. progressively less conservative housing finance, while the discourse in Belgium is that housing finance is relatively conservative. The comparison is often made to the Netherlands, which in a way is one of the most extreme versions of housing finance, together with Denmark and Norway, more extreme than the UK and the US in how easy it is to get mortgage finance. So by taking an extreme counterexample, it may look like the Belgian housing finance system is very conservative, while it actually is not. The reality is also one of increasing inequalities, increasing fractions of housing-based wealth between different groups of society, like Susan has discussed also very well. And there's also an idea that there's a 10-year neutrality in Belgium where renting and owning are treated in the same way. But this has never really existed and still does not exist in Belgium. So what is actually the case is that the financialized home ownership model based on mortgage finance is undermining the stability of homeowner realities and practices. What we need instead is what Susan has discussed as post-capitalist and participatory housing transformations. And she mentioned Gert-Jan Wijburg, one of my former PhD students. He talks about the definancialization of housing. So that's a very interesting paper. It's an open access paper, so you don't need to try to think how the name Gert-Jan Wijburg would be spelled. If you just Google the definancialization of housing, and it's an article in the journal Housing Studies, and it's an open access article, so anyone can download it. You don't need to be part of an academic library. It's a great paper that discusses quite systematically ways that we can destabilize the current system of financialization and therefore come up with alternatives. Alternatives that we could discuss under the term housing commoning. That is one part. You could think of things like you could think of things like limited equity cooperatives. There's all kinds of other models where, for instance, community land trusts, where the land is shared among the people, but people have their own house. Susan discusses this as 1,000 tiny tenures. So it's basically offering more alternatives than just owning a house through a mortgage or renting a house through a social housing that is not available in large enough numbers. Or in a private rental market that's not well regulated. But I think itself, social housing also is something that deserves to have more investment. I don't think we only need to look for new alternatives. I think we have existing models out there that we can invest more money in, and especially more efforts in. So in the end, that should lead to a less financialized and less commodified housing market. And that's where I would like to end. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Manuel. That was really interesting. It's a really nice combination of the more general ideas that you wanted to raise and the specifics of the Belgium case and the contradictions therein. So I think those two presentations have really complemented each other, actually, so that's been really helpful. Okay, we're now going to move into the awkward transition of moving from individual speakers into a kind of round table setting, which is how we're going to work the second hour. So I'd like to set that up with my colleagues who are organising how this is all working. And so I'd like to, if we could reintroduce Susan to the virtual table. And everybody's there. I was going to do that one by one, but it's been done for me. That's great. So the eagle-eyed amongst you will notice that we have two additional people here, and I'd like to introduce them. First of all, we have Mary Murphy, who is Professor of Sociology at Maynooth University, and it's great to have you here, Mary. And also we have Dr. Declan Redmond from UCD, who is an expert in housing and planning there, and again, a former colleague of mine, and we work together also at the Dublin Housing Observatory now. So, to get things started, you've already heard from our two main speakers, our keynote speaker and Manuel's response, but I'd like, if they would like, for Mary and Declan to make a brief kind of response to what they've heard so far. Maybe that's a good way to get us started. So, Mary, could I ask you first?
Sure. You can hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. Just let me start by, welcoming the event. I think it's really timely. And to thank for the invitation. I just wanted to kick off where Susan kicked off, actually, because I really welcomed her question about whether the post-pandemic regime change might bring us to a new kind of understanding of what's possible. And I totally agree with her argument that we can't rely on the pandemic to re-baseline the future. And I think that's true very much in Ireland. I think the narrative is increasingly get back to business as usual or get back to normal. And I think to some degree that's because we often overestimate the degree to which crisis might be transformational, when the evidence showed us, even in the last crisis, that Naomi Klein shock doctrine is much more likely that crisis often reinforces the present regime. So I really liked what Manuel was saying about, you know, the need to destabilise the ideology of asset-based welfare, that needs to be the project underlying a break in the kind of common sense narrative that's there, the cognitive lock that we have about home ownership being so central to the Irish model. And I think the Belgium example was very apposite there. And for that reason, I really, really liked the image both speakers brought about enlarging the housing imaginary. And I think to some degree, the biggest type of poverty we can face is that poverty of the imagination. And they both offered lots of institutional possibilities, the 1,000 tiny tenures, or the idea of decommodified housing as a way forward, that concept of definancialisation of housing. I think as in a way of opening up our imagination, that's really important. And no better place for it to start than through local ideas being manifested through local authorities as pilots and ways of trying to bring about different images of how housing can happen. I think, though, Susan's combining of that with the value of care, I think is really important in drawing together that work by Emma Power on infrastructure of care embedded in a housing ethic. And that's really important, and it really brings home some of the lessons from the pandemic in relation to particularly gender and the role of the home, the value of the home and the place of care therein. I think personally, and this isn't being provocative, but I would wonder, is housing just one of the things we need to imagine here? And what we more need to imagine is the place of housing alongside lots of other services like care, like health, like employment services, bringing them all together and reimagining them as universal services based around non-commodified provision. So the role of the public becomes important there. And I think, you know, the phrase that we've been talking about, or the United Nations even has been pushing, and it's very common in Britain, less so in Ireland, this kind of build back better kind of mantra. And I wondered, are we better thinking of building forward public, or that the future needs to be public in some way and non-commodified, definancialised, and that lets our imaginations run wild, as Susan said. I think allowing my own imagination run wild just for a second, I'm bringing again Manuel's story of Irish housing and that idea of housing movements and how they can be mobilised. I think we can let our imagination run a bit wild in the story of housing in Ireland. And going back to some of the debates in the Land League, pre the foundation of the modern Irish state, when people's imaginations were wilder and some of their visions of the role of housing and the demands they made for the 3Fs, fixity or tenure, fair rents, but also free sale, which to my mind was a different imagination about what ownership was and where the role of housing was embedded into people's lives and what they needed to be able to do in relation to the use of their housing in order to build other aspects of their lives. So I think there's so much here, and I really thank both speakers for allowing us to trigger our imaginations. And I hope the rest of the discussion goes in that direction, that we can, you know, use it as a way of opening up and breaking some of the cognitive locks that we have in relation to housing in Ireland. Thanks.
Great, thank you very much. That's an excellent start, Mary. Thank you. Breaking the cognitive locks, I like that. That's good. Declan, can you also give us some initial thoughts?
I can give you some initial thoughts. I'm not sure if I'm going to break any cognitive locks yet at this early. What I want to do is a couple of reflections, really, just broadly on how the local situation here in Ireland is similar or dissimilar to what Susan and Manuel have described. And I think broadly speaking, there are huge similarities here. So if I kind of give a potted kind of history of, from post financial crisis, and I want to use one of Manuel's phrases. In a lot of his writing, he talked about a wall of money in terms of credit, which came into Ireland, in terms of buying up land, building houses, and in terms of mortgages as well. that flooded into the country in the late 90s and into the 2000s. And it was dependent essentially on a purely speculative model of housing development. The social housing provision was really neglected, and affordable housing was also generally neglected. So coming out of that, I'm not going to go into the whole history of the crash and austerity, but I suppose in the last number of years where we've got quite low levels of private housing supply in terms of from the speculative market, and a lot of that is at such high prices, as Susan said. It's been produced, but it's quite expensive. So a lot of people are locked out of getting mortgages. And one thing we have done, which I think is really positive, the central bank have brought back macroprudential rules, maybe not unlike Belgium, and that has been a really important way of stabilizing prices. And the ESRI here have done some excellent work recently, showing that if that wasn't there, prices would still be increasing even despite the pandemic. The other hand, we've had very low levels of social housing production and affordable housing production, where capital monies have gone into, to a relatively low level of building. We now are putting money into giving money to local authorities and housing associations to lease properties. I'm not sure that's particularly great value for money. And so because of that sort of lack of supply on both sides, what's happened is you have a huge number of people getting into the private renting market. So people who can afford to pay the market rents, and people who can't. So we now have a huge amount of money going in terms of various forms of rental subsidy, various forms of housing benefit. And if you actually look at that as a totality, it's been billions over the last number of years. So that has been sort of useful in terms of it delivers immediate need, but I think in terms of long-term value for money, very, very questionable. And one thing Susan and both Manuel brought up is also the arrival of global institutions. That's been really, really important, not necessarily in a positive way. So we have real estate investment trust. There's a lot of debate about vulture funds, cuckoo funds, buying up, say, apartment blocks and then renting them out privately, or indeed renting them out to local authorities and AHBs. So we're not in a great position. So to move on to the second quick reflection, and I'll hand back to Ken in a minute. Housing transformations, where are we? Well, I think we have some really good ideas coming out of the National Economic and Social Council, and I'm kind of really like to refer to their work over the last number, maybe 10 years or more. They have done superb policy analysis and recommendations, and we might come back to that in terms of what can we take up from their analysis to move forward. We also, just to sort of on that as well, as with the OECD, in terms of possibly a move to changing things, the OECD are also pushing that states invest much more in social and affordable housing. So there's a bit of movement in terms of the ideology of where we should be going on housing, but whether that will happen, I think, is an open question. So I'll hand back to Ken there now.
Thank you very much, Declan. That's been really helpful to get us going. I think before I ask my first question, I'm going to ask Susan if you would like to respond to what you've heard this afternoon, particularly from Manuel, but maybe also from our two more local speakers.
Well, thanks, Ken. I mean, I thought all of the comments and follow up actually were absolutely spot on, and I particularly like the idea that whether you do it through housing or through some other institutions, the idea would really be to think about, the way whole societies could be different, because we have thought about that in the past. I mean, the old idea of a social contract where you can actually build in a different set of values, really, than the ones that we normally are forced to practice when we engage in, say, most housing systems today. It really does. I really do think it's worth revisiting some of those ideas and seeing which of them are current today. I've always said that the old social contract ideas got very a big critique really from the feminist literature, because they were very patriarchal in their presumptions about family and gender relations. But the feminist ethic of care that kind of followed up from that, that's a great partnership, you know, to really think about the relationship between public and private life, and what quality of relationships, what quality of engagement do you want to valorize. All our kind of contracts these days, all our language is about individuals, you know, pulling themselves up with their own bootstraps. All you know, the language of politics is just full of that kind of discourse. But it doesn't have to be like that. So I do like that idea of taking the bigger trope, if you like, as a starting point. I think this issue about land and the value of land and what's happening with land is a really big one, because you know, if you look at the whole kind of history of home ownership and all of the problems that we associate with it, the one thing that it did do actually through that whole turn to inequality was it did put more asset value in the hands of ordinary people than they'd ever had. In the early 20th century, most people owned nothing and paid rent. You know, by the end of the 20th century, that people may have been highly mortgaged, but they did have the title to an asset that held future value, if you like. So the fact that if home ownership is on the decline, that bit of people's wealth is being hoovered out into big corporates that are operating on the global economy kind of sort of starts to make me think that we've kind of lost everything. So I think we've got to think really very carefully about what happens to land and who can have it, and how we think about the ownership of that land. It's a really big question. And just on that point about the idea that you know, the people's wealth is slipping out of owner occupation and into the hands of you know, rather big global corporates, let's call them that. Just to pick up that point that Manuel made about the, you know, there's a diverse geography as well as a history of the way home ownership is changing. And one of the things that we found in our Edges of Ownership project, and I did mean to mention at the end actually that I'm working on that with, if I just could, with Gavin Wood, Rachel Long, Bill Clark, also Kwon Trong, and Bill Lizowski, just because I forgot to put the slide up at the end. Anyway, in that project, one of the things that we also show is the way that the mortgaged frontier of owner occupation is actually moving up the age range. So it's not just young people who are getting indebted, but older households are using that facility to borrow against property to release funds to buy other things, meet pressing spending needs, that kind of thing. And I also wonder about that sort of equity extraction at the end of the life course. Manuel and I had a little exchange about some work on care homes and the way that some of these big corporates are moving into that sector as well, and if you like, acquiring the housing wealth that older people once had as outright ownership and turned over to the next generation. So that's just a few immediate thoughts anyway of some of the direction of travel that we might want to engage in the conversation.
Thanks very much, Susan. I would like to respond to a couple of those points actually. I did some work a couple of years ago about housing wealth inequality in Scotland with the Resolution Foundation and with Duncan McLennan. And one of the striking things looking at housing wealth inequality over time in Scotland and in the UK as a whole was that initially, at least, the growth of home ownership actually reduced wealth inequality to some extent in a relative sense. But clearly the peaking of home ownership and its decline is actually facilitated, has been associated alongside an increasing upturn in that kind of in equality, which kind of speaks to what you were just saying. I think I think that whole sort of questions are very interesting. One of the interesting sort of sets of numbers that's often bandied about is the consequences of cohorts of people who would have been homeowners not being homeowners, and the need for them to invest more in potential pensions, which can actually be extremely expensive and is well beyond the wherewithal of most people, but also that there are public sector costs associated with it as well in the form of housing benefit, because people will still be paying rent, so there will be social security obligations as well. So there are real kind of direct and societal costs of of change which hasn't thought through what better or different alternatives there might actually be out there. I'm going to turn to a first question for everyone now. We've got some questions. We've also got some questions coming in, so we'll try and work our way through them. So the first question relates to the fact that I understand that the Irish government has put forward the notion of a housing commission, which will try to seek consensus over, policy direction. And so I thought a nice place to start would be to ask each of you what you think, given what we've been talking about, what we are talking about today, what ought to be the priority of that commission in terms of the kinds of policies that it might proceed with. So you have a commission working on the sort of housing system as a whole, thinking about housing policy. What should be the priority for it to work with? So could I start with Manuel? Would that be okay? See what you think?
Yeah, it's okay. Can you all hear me?
Yep.
Okay, good. Just checking this time before I start talking, and it turns out no one hears me again. Okay, great. So I'm not so familiar with these committees, but I would just think of what I would do if I would rethink Irish housing policy, and I think it's very much focused on home ownership. So I think one good thing would be to think about alternatives to home ownership. As I mentioned, Susan talks about 1,000 tiny tenures, Gert-Jan Wijberg about definancization of housing. We can call it commoning of housing. So I think the first thing would just be open up the realm and talk about all these other alternatives. I think their affordability is the big question, of course. But it shouldn't be just about affordability of existing mortgage-based housing. I think what has happened a lot in the past, people said like, well, the houses are so expensive, we need bigger mortgages. Because if we have better access to mortgages, we can buy these more expensive houses. But what happens over time is that by giving people bigger mortgages, they're able to buy bigger houses, right? And then we get this whole problem of the land becoming more expensive. And then people say like, well, the land is too expensive, therefore the houses are too expensive. No, people were able to borrow a lot of money and therefore all bidding up the housing prices for those same houses, driving up the prices, not just of the housing, but also of the land and of new land that can be developed. So we need to break through that loop. And I think what we have seen in the last decade, since the global financial crisis of 2008, is that at some point that machine that just at every time there was something wrong said, okay, we expand further, that machine doesn't work anymore. We've known that since 2008, but we haven't really come up with a new machine. We haven't really fixed the machine. We can no longer expand the machine, but the new machine, we've been thinking about it for a long time. I mean, things like housing commoning is not something new. These are old ideas, but I think we fail to implement them. And I think it would be good for a committee like that to just be aware of the richness of all the different kind of alternatives that are around in the world. And also that it's very well possible to regulate your private rental market. I think that's another important one, where it's easy to start with. It takes a while to build up 1,000 tiny tenures. We should still do it, but I think regulating the private rental sector, you can start doing tomorrow. I think another one is using zoning and urban planning rights to say if you build new housing, it needs to be so much percent needs to be social housing, so much of it needs to be affordable home ownership, whatever, however that would be defined. And I think if we start by discussing these kind of things, we can think of different strategies that we can have within a year, strategies that we can have within 5 years, and things that will probably take decades to change. But we have to do all things.
Great, thanks very much, Manuel. Can I move over to Mary and ask your thoughts?
Sure, yeah. I've done my time on a couple of commissions in Ireland, and I think the most fundamental lesson I learned is that the terms of reference are massively, massively, massively important in setting the agenda and ruling out certain things that you can never get on the agenda once the terms of reference are set. So I think it's a really important question. But the other thing that I've learned from them is that they are often places where ideas die a death. Where that old truism that if you want to kill something, make a commission or put it on a committee. And so I do think that we've learned quite a lot in Ireland recently about more participative and deliberative ways of doing policy that are less technocratic in their orientation. and that allow wider debates about what society wants, rather than expert-led debates about what's possible within a much narrower frame of reference. And I think that's really important. So what the terms of reference is, but also what the mechanics of the deliberation are on such a commission. I would argue we should learn from some of the citizen assembly lessons and try and have a much wider societal-led debate about it. I think unless we do destabilise the ideology, unless we kind of break that cognitive lock of market domination, the terms of reference from the Commission will be very heavily oriented towards making the market work better. And I think we would really miss an opportunity. So I think in terms of, as Manuel was saying, putting on the agenda those 1,000 alternatives, the 1,000 tiny alternatives. So at least a third of the work of the Commission being about getting public housing right, a third being about societal-led models of housing, different levels of ownership, roles of co-ops, commoning, and maybe some of it then being about the market, but also things like the cost of land, and also things like a rights framing of the housing debate. I think all of those things need to be very early in terms of what the reference would be. That's probably enough from me on that.
Thanks very much. Susan, do you want to suggest a priority?
My one is tax. I don't actually know what the tax structure is in Ireland, but I think tax on land, tax on investment returns. I mean, certainly in England, in many countries, I'm guessing Ireland's the same. We tax the returns on primary residence as if it was as if you were in a gambling casino, you know, and you just get the returns free. They should be taxed, or tax on imputed rent. I mean, there's a lot of tax that could be looked at. I definitely think the Commission should look at tax and should look at the possibility of using tax and new taxes or restructured taxes to create a sort of infrastructure fund that could be used for housing, and that, you know, eventually in that slide I showed of Piketty's temporary ownership idea, you could eventually use tax to make people feel differently, think differently about housing. And then you could perhaps get from owner occupation to some kind of collectivized understanding of the housing stock, a collectivized feel for it, some kind of collective stewardship of it that would allow owner occupation to kind of rather naturally loosen its grip over households' imaginations, and then you'd be set for your 1,000 tiny tenures. So tax is my answer.
Thank you very much. I'll just finish off with Declan, then I'll maybe say a word or two as well. Declan.
Thanks, Ken. I think, to me, one of the critical things is picking up on what Susan said earlier about land. And I feel like a student here. I would like to acknowledge the National Economic and Social Council again. I don't want to be accused of plagiarism at my age. So I think they, you know, one of the things they have talked about is, you know, exploring various forms of land value capture. And there's a lot of work being done internationally on that. I know my colleague in UCD, Michelle Norris, is involved in the UN 2030 Commission, and her and colleagues are looking at that in detail. So that's going to be really interesting. Julie Lawson has produced some fantastic work recently out of that on different ways of land assembly. The Scottish Land Commission have also produced a lot of work. So we know a lot of what's happening and how we might do it. I think one of the key things politically here in Ireland is that any time you mention land, you know, public land acquisition, or particularly at use value or existing use value, you're accused. There was a previous commission, back to Mary, on this, you know, and people who were talking about land value capture were told they were Stalinists. So it's an extremely sensitive issue politically, and you're always thrown back to the Irish Constitution that, you know, doing too much on land value capture might be unconstitutional. I'm not a lawyer, so I don't know how strong that argument is, but I think that needs to be trashed out, because in the long run, we really have to sort out the issue of getting land for public housing, for social and affordable housing, for local authorities or for approved housing bodies. So that to me is absolutely fundamental. Because the moment, as Susan rightly says, you know, land is being sort of gobbled up by private interests. And I think we might come back, Ken, I'm not going to discuss it now. There is a proposal for a land development agency, which we might discuss in a little bit more detail. The second thing is that, again, there's this notion of permanent affordability, that we need to engineer a system where rents or mortgages are permanently affordable. Now, that I think needs to be broken down a lot more. There's a lot of general talk about affordability, but we haven't certainly got down to very detailed analysis of how we define affordability for different cohorts, different households, and that's a job of work. But again, that's easily done, relatively easily done, I think. So they would be my two priorities. But I do just before I come back to you, Ken, just to say that I do slightly worry that the terms of reference they will be set by government, and what's included and what is excluded may be problematic. So back to you.
Thank you very, very much. I just make 2 or 3 comments. I think of what we've heard. I think tax is an absolute priority as well, Susan. I've always been struck by this notion that we essentially choose not to tax housing and land to a large extent, and that actually reduces our options in other areas of fiscal policy. And in particular in Scotland, which is a devolved system, we're heavily reliant on income tax. If we actually, and that's really difficult because Labour's a mobile factor of production, and the government's under real pressure not to use income tax in a progressive kind of fashion. But if they actually taxed land and property, if they had a full go on land value tax kind of set of arrangements, you could imagine circumstances where you could tilt the tax base away from income tax, and you could spread that tax base much more widely. So there are progressive reasons for and economic efficiency reasons for taxing land, and for finding sensible ways to tax property wealth or increases in capital value without them being at marginally high tax rates. But at the same time, you could actually compensate people by reducing the income tax rates you need. So there is that kind of lack of imagination, as people have been saying all day, and it doesn't just apply to housing policies and housing tenure. It's the challenge of thinking quite hard about redistributing tax bases and taxation for a purpose. I must admit also, secondly, that I'm a kind of obviously an economist by background, and I would always believe that making markets work better is better than letting them work worse, as it were. And I think there's always that kind of challenge in these things. But I certainly think intelligent regulation and really tackling market abuse and market failure is really important. Of course it is, but I would certainly hope that markets that don't work, we can think creatively about ways of making them work better. And a lot of the taxation literature is actually about that sort of thing. So that we had a really big review of tax policy in the UK by James McMurley's and the IFS about 10 years ago in Britain. And one of the things that argues strongly for was to sort of tax excess gains, focus on investment of assets, including property, and tax excess gains on these things. Kind of John Hill's talked about these things as well, quite a lot. So I think there are ways where we can think about how do we neutralise the impact of the economy, of the housing market on the economy. Certainly from the point of view of individual investors. So I think that's definitely something in that. Now we've had a couple of questions that have come in, and I want to ask you them. So I'm going to start with the first one, which relates to Susan's 1,000 micro tenures idea, and speaks to 2 innovations which of course are in place already, but maybe on a small scale. And I guess the author of the question is called Jim Roach, is trying to push the argument a little bit further on these perhaps. His question is, are co-housing and community land trusts a possible option for housing transformation? And I think Manuel mentions community land trusts. He also says, and how do we convince our governments to enable their progressive models? So there's a sense of whether these models, like co-housing and community land trusts, are viable parts of the answer. And secondly, that political question of how do we persuade and influence governments to actually pursue them. So I'll maybe start with Manuel, since you raised community land trusts, I think.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I mean, the first part of the question is the easy part, right? Yes, I think they are a good alternative. I don't think this should be the only one. One reason why I like Susan's phrase of the 1,000 tiny tenures so much, because first, it's very catchy. Secondly, because it shows we need a diversity of options. It's not about the community land trust being the best one, or housing cooperative being the best one, or limited equity cooperatives being the best one. I think several of these work really well in some contexts, but they also don't work so well in other contexts. I think many of these solutions or alternatives, they have a problem of being scaled up. They rely on commenting, which I'm generally in favor of, as I mentioned. They rely on bottom-up processes, which again I think are good, but I don't think they necessarily work so well for everyone. So I think they have a lot of potential, but I think it's good that all these things exist next to each other. I mean, there's also people who, it's not like they don't have an interest in being part of one of these sort of bottom-up communities of housing, but that some people are just busy surviving. I mean, in every big city, but also outside the big cities, you have people who are just so busy surviving, they don't have time to go to community meetings and get these things together. So I think it is a very good alternative, but it should be one of the many, many alternatives there. And therefore, I also am not one of the people who thinks the state should just let sort of the community development go forward and facilitate that and don't do anything itself. I think social housing is an important part of that puzzle. So I just want to repeat that. How we have to convince government about that, I am less sure. I think Ken just said like something valuable, which is that if you tax some of these things, you don't have to tax other things. I think another important thing people need to realize is that, yes, if you own a home, you don't want it to be worth less. But many people, one of the reasons that they don't want their house to be worth less is because they want to use their equity to support their kids. But they wouldn't need so much to use all of the equities to support their kids if the housing would be cheaper also for their kids. So I think there's quite some contradictions there in how people think about this. So these contradictions that I mentioned about financialized home ownership, they are just part of, I think, the other contradictions that we have very often in our thinking about housing. And it's not easy to just put that into a bullet point and tell people like, okay, this is what needs to change. This takes quite a long time, this shift. I see here in Belgium that 10-year neutral policies have been on the agenda for a long time, but only recently the policymakers, I'm not talking about the politicians, I'm talking about the policymakers in terms of the civil servants who work in like housing departments, especially in the regional ones that are very important here. They start to realize what it means to have these kind of policies. So I think this is a long-term process, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be starting that process or furthering that process. Thanks.
Thanks for it very much. Would anybody else like to answer or provide some thoughts on that question that was asked? Mary?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Manuel about the need for the diversity of options and the need to really ensure that public options remain within that menu of options. But I think one thing to clearly put on the table in an Irish context is the role of the local authority therein and the real challenges that Irish local authorities have in terms of their own power and capacity and resources. In a local autonomy index of the strength of local authorities across Europe, Ireland regularly comes out, you know, the very last 2 or 3 countries in terms of the strength of the central government vis-a-vis the absolute weakness of what really is a local administrative system rather than a local government system. And just some practical examples there, directly the experience of Cloughjordan Eco-Village, who, you know, a very strongly social capitalised community of people, really eager, obvious land banks, and working really constructively with Tipperary County Council, but the limits to which the County Council could enable creative community-led options. A lot of it got to do with the nature of the institution of the local authority and the degree to which they don't have taxation or power or legal or policy autonomy. I think the other example I'd like to offer you just happened yesterday, and it was Alison Gillard, the chair of the Housing Strategic Policy Committee in Dublin City Council, by far the largest and strongest local authority council in the state, and a seminar attended by a lot of city councillors looking at the cost of public housing provision and how complicated it is. And these are part-time councillors who are, you know, holding down full-time jobs in many instances, also caring for children and caring for family members and being local community activists. And the real challenge there is in the context of Irish local government, both for the political side and the policy side, to do any real enabling of these sort of more diverse types of 10 years, and also to consolidate the likelihood of maximising public housing build. So I think institution building, empowering local authorities, giving them legal powers, money raising powers, resource staffing, all that has to be part of the agenda of answering that question. Okay, thanks.
Thank you very much. What you just said there is really interesting, because I'm involved in a project just now which is about developing new models of affordable rent, and it seems incredibly clear now that what's really required is something really simple, something which doesn't rely on really fancy private finance, which is something which is difficult to communicate or actually to really ever makes sense of to a local tenant board of a housing association, or to councillors who say, or indeed to most professional people for that matter. We're trying to develop something which is really simple, a bit of public loan, a bit of private loan, and that's it. That's really it. Nothing else, and you can generate a sub-market rent with that, and that's really the starting point, you know. So I think that was one of the lessons I think people at Manuel made so abundantly clear about the global financial crisis. There was that disconnect between what a very small group of people were doing and the consequences and implications of it, and how you make decisions on that basis. You know, how you make sensible decisions. That's very hard. Anyone else like to say anything about these community land trusts or co-ownership ideas? Or shall we move on? I've now got a lot of questions from the audience to get into, so I shall maybe go on to another one. I've got one here which must reflect perhaps my disciplinary bias. I don't really know what it means, so I'm going to ask you it anyway, and I'm sure you'll be able to help me. It's from Steve Margolis, and the question is, what role should conscious capitalism have in transformation? Now, does that make sense?
Not sure.
Anyone want to have a go? No. This may be a translation of the original question through to the person who sent me the question. So I might ask Stephen Margos if he wants to maybe send it again, and we can see if if we have misunderstood what he was trying to say. So I hope we'll come back to that. That's probably the best idea. Right, Juliana Sassy asks a question about something again which has turned up in the discussion already, but I think is worth exploring further. Is there a risk of monopoly due to the rise of corporate landlords? And I think I would add to that, what does that actually mean? In what sense are we talking about monopoly? Is it choice as far as tenants are concerned? Is it about control over an area? It could be any or other things, I guess, as well. So has anybody got a view about that, about the role that these corporate landlords have? Manuel.
Yeah, I will reflect just on the German situation. Gert-Jan Wijberg was mentioned before, the person who wrote about the definancization of housing. One reason he started writing about that, because in his PhD, he looked into corporate landlords in Germany and in France, and especially in the German case. I think what is often poorly understood is that in Germany, in 10 years' time, more housing was privatized than through the right to buy in the UK in 30 years' time. So the biggest privatization I know of, at least in Europe, was in Germany. And the result was that housing in Germany, a lot of it is now owned by corporate landlords. The largest landlord in Germany owns more than 400,000 units. It owns about 50 to 80,000 also in a few neighboring countries. So it owns almost 500,000 units. In some of these neighborhoods, it has a near monopoly on the housing. This is actually part of the strategy of some of these housing associations. Matthias Berndt and colleagues from Berlin have also written about this in the case of the shrinking city of Halle, where actually in one district, one of these landlords is so dominant that it can set the prices, it can set the quality. And because Germany actually has a good system supporting low-income tenants, it can actually exploit that system quite well, because they know exactly how much they can charge, so that tenants can still pay the rent and can use the maximum subsidy, and therefore they can maximize the rent at the same time. So I think in terms of area, in terms of neighborhood, in terms of price setting, there's definitely a risk of monopoly. In terms of market segments, this is partly overlapping, of course, because some housing is more represented in some places than in others. So I think there is a real risk there. I could speak about that for much longer, but I'm not going to do that because I would like to hear the other panel as well.
I think the German example sounds really interesting. It speaks greatly to England. Now everybody wants to jump in now. Susan.
Yeah, it's just a quick thought, sort of based on that. I think there is something really worrying going on about the kind of hoovering up of all wealth of all kinds, but particularly of land and the property that's on it, by these massive funds that trade globally and internationally, and are that absolutely classic example of monopoly rentierism. And I was reading recently as well about the mass migration of money, into index funds controlled by a few really, really big, investment corporates. And it feels like, you're going sort of back to the future, like these proprietarian ownership societies, as Piketty calls them, where, a few controlling interests have everything. So I think there is something to worry about with this kind of monopoly rentier class of, investor organisations, of corporates that are moving into the market, and they certainly should be, scrutinised really carefully and probably regulated more effectively than they are.
Yeah, yeah. I'll come back to that in a second. Declan.
Yeah, I can't really speak to the issue of monopoly, but certainly since the financial crash here, and there has been quite a number of large global institutions have come in, bought property. Now, in some cases, they've bought it really cheaply off NAMA or Bad Bank. Other cases, they're buying it more recently. So they're buying, say, very large apartment schemes, either renting it out to, privately to private tenants, or in some cases, and this is the kind of bit that worries me a bit, and colleagues like Rory Hearn in Maynooth have written about this, and Richard Waldron, that the Irish government now has a scheme where local authorities, and I think housing associations, I'm not sure, can lease these units as social housing units. So, like, there's cases which have got a lot of publicity here where a large German institutional fund bought a scheme to the south of the city, and now that's been leased at what seems certainly very expensive headline rents by the local authority, funded via central government. And it's been justified to some extent by, well, we have big housing waiting lists, so we need to act, and if this is one of the mechanisms, that we must use that. To me now, it's a signal of a failed housing system, a broken system. I really worry about it.
Okay, thank you. I'm just thinking from what Susan was saying about, what seems part of the fundamental issue here, of course, is that for 20 years now, real returns elsewhere in the economy have been so poor, and we've also in a low inflationary environment, which seems to be with us for forever. And part of the growth in this obsessive grabbing of land and property as an asset, and has made it a speculative asset more so. It seems to me that it's now a driver of probably those low returns elsewhere, and that, so it's kind of come round full circle, and probably at a really macro level, part of all this is actually about how you break that cycle that we seem to be in, which is obviously the huge question that confronts us all. So really challenging. I haven't had anything back yet from our first question I wasn't sure what it meant. So I'm going to press on if that's okay. Got some other interesting questions here. And a question about politics, which I think is quite interesting. Paul Leach says, can governance at whatever level actually bring about the correctives needed or the policy reforms needed? And what he's saying is, how can this happen given our empirical voting dynamics? Now, again, I don't know if he's speaking specifically about Ireland. I think there are certainly issues in the UK and NIMBY issues and things of that sort. But I wonder what people think about, whether democratic mechanisms can be more enabling and facilitative of the kinds of things that we seem to be talking about. Would anyone like to say something about that?
Yeah, I don't mind starting, because I suppose it is that question we opened up with, which was like, will post-pandemic be a possibility for regime change? And to some degree, I mean, one of my fears is that in Ireland, we had a politics of mobilisation around housing, and particularly around the need for public housing, leading into the February 2020 general election, where health and housing were the two big issues that drove a quite dramatic electoral outcome. And that was about change and transformation. And in a way, the pandemic has gotten in the way of that dynamic, and we don't know where it might have led in terms of the debate and the mobilisation behind it. So I do think that there is room for different types of electoral politics in Ireland that could generate a greater agenda around some of these kind of policy ideas that we're talking about, but that we, you know, again, we don't know where we are right now in relation to that. One of the fears I have is that the low level of trust that there is in political institutions will feed into a low level of trust in public policy orientated solutions to all of this, and reinforce the market being the inevitable solution. And I think we really need to be imaginative and find ways to make sure that that doesn't happen in the public narrative when people are very anxious and they're not seeing the public response and management of COVID as well as they might. On the other hand, I think as things change and maybe we come out of the pandemic, public confidence may have grown, and there could be something to capitalise on there in relation to the public possibilities it gives rise to.
Okay, and anybody else? Yeah, Declan.
Just a very quick political point, that housing as an issue in the last two general elections, at least here in Ireland, has been probably the core upfront issue, right? So in that sense, I think there is potentially a basis, for at next election or elections to put pressure on governments to change systems. Now, obviously, there's a huge difference between pressure and the government's actually doing something, but I think there is at least something there, and there certainly has been some, housing protest movements. People like Rory Hearn, that he has documented those. So some possibilities is all I'd say.
Okay, thank you. Susan.
Yeah, I was just going to quickly say, I mean, one of the things that strikes me is that the very high level of inequality that we see in our societies today is one of the things that really has undermined people's faith in politics, and perhaps ironically that might force people into social movements that enact change in a different way. But from the point of view of politicians and those managing, doing governance, I think the challenge is to find ways gradually to nudge the balance towards engaging ordinary people again. I mean, most people's incomes have been stagnating, since the 1990s. Most people have had to take on more debt than they ideally would want to in order to kind of get their, self-insuring homeowner, owned home in place. Well, we've just got to find a way gradually to show people who are losing out from that you're interested in promoting their interests, and so get more people actually interested in democratic politics and really willing to exercise their democratic rights and move in a slightly different direction. So in a way, there's a kind of win-win here, I think, on politics. Either people remain a bit alienated and get involved in housing movements and therefore, force some change through, or governments, national, local, and even on, in smaller communities are able to win people's trust again by taking steps that people know are in their interest, that make them feel more secure, more cared for, more engaged, and have less to worry about in terms of how their housing works.
Thank you. Manuel.
Yeah, I'll just go very quickly. I think in principle, at every level of government, something could be done, right? In different countries, housing, of course, is differently organized, differently regulated. But we have to remember that housing policy is not just housing policy that's defined as such. It is financial policy, it is tax policy, it is social policy, it is urban planning policy. So these will be differently organized in countries, but there will be some things that are organized at the national or federal level. Some may be organized at the regional level, some may be organized locally or metropolitan. Again, it's going to be different everywhere, but I think at every level there will be something that can be done there to how this impacts on housing. Income policy, of course, is another one that impacts heavily on housing. So the answer is yes, I think in principle we could, especially if we take a very wide definition of housing.
Thank you. I think that's a very good point, and I think one that there's a multi-level governance of housing, and that kind of cross-sectoral public policy domains that impact on housing is very important. I'm now going to massively abuse my position and ask a question which is directed to me and to Declan, if that's okay. It's a bit on the technical side, but I think it's actually very practical as well. So I was asked whether I could provide any insight into the Scottish experience of housing needs and demand assessment, which is a part of our planning system now. That's relevant in Ireland because it's now being looked at seriously in Ireland as a way of doing things. So just to put this in a wee bit of context, Scottish housing has a social and affordable housing supply programme, which is currently building 50,000 units in a parliamentary term over 5 years. And it's just been announced that if the current government wins the election in May, then they will have another programme of a similar size. That's based on a national needs assessment, which is done independently of government. But that then has to translate, or the kind of national policy aspiration has to translate into a local authority or housing market partnership level set of needs assessments. So there's a formula-driven model which draws on demographic, housing and homelessness and other data to generate, under a series of assumptions, a number of local needs estimates, and they then relate to the kind of land supply assumptions that follow through from that. And that model has been used for about 13, 14 years now in several iterations in Scotland. And it's basically being exported because it seems to work. So the Welsh are developing it, Northern Ireland is developing it, and I know that my colleagues in the Scottish Government have been talking to people in Dublin as well. So it's an important policy step that we've kind of got used to in Scotland, but it remains quite contentious. It seems to be becoming slightly more centralised than it used to be. The assumptions are stronger from the Scottish Government, which making deviations in those assumptions has to be justified in a lot of depth and detail, making it quite hard to do that, I guess. So that's kind of what's happening in Scotland. But maybe, Declan, you want to say something about what's happening in Ireland with respect to that?
Yes, I think there's a kind of local policy or political context to it in that we have a national planning framework produced in 2018, which is a plan for the entire country. And in that it says local authorities must produce a housing needs and demand assessment. So that's one thing. Now, in the meantime, we have a set of central guidelines on apartment development, which essentially is a diktat to local authorities saying if a developer wants to have, say, lots of studios, 1 beds, 2 beds, no 3 beds, they must accept that. And the only reason they can change it is if they have a housing needs and demand assessment. Now, at the moment, my understanding is this template is in embryonic form, and local authorities have not got it. But there's a tension, as you can imagine, between local authorities who want to have discretion as to how the kind of planning permissions they give, and the kind of centralised system that is currently there where developers can put in essentially what they want. So I think there's the political dimension, or policy dimension, which does need to be solved. So we do need guidance, and we need the local authorities to then do these HNDAs. But there is also the kind of other issue that theoretically these should be very good ways of actually estimating need and demand and building in kind of more sophisticated analyses of affordability into our system. So it's I think potentially a very positive move, and we need to get on with it basically.
Thank you thanks very much. I'm not expecting lots of other people wanting to leap up and make some comments about this. Rather, it's not actually that dry really, because it's obviously politically really important at local level how these things work out in practice. I'm going to return to the questions, but just before I do that, I should say I'm being communicated with as this goes along, and we think we're going to extend the conversation till 10 past the hour. So we're not going to stop in 5 minutes. We've got enough time for 15 minutes worth or so of questions yet. So I hope that's okay with everybody, and the audience is still sending us in lots of questions. So Let's carry on. Next question is an interesting one from Hugh Brennan, and he says, does segregating social and affordable housing in our minds lead to segregation on the ground? Can we look at something like affordable public housing? So this is about this debate between what's fundamentally social and what we mean by council housing in our minds relative to something more affordable and somewhere between social and market rents. And should we be worried about the segregation that might entail, or is that, or is it not as straightforward as that? So does anybody have a view about these kinds of distinctions between social and affordable and the like? Declan.
Yeah, sort of hogging it a bit. It's I mean, this is an international debate about mixed tenure, and I think there is the background here. There certainly has been mixed tenure has been used in a positive sense of saying let's not create large scale social housing estates, of single, one income, single class, etc. On the other hand, I think it can be used in a fairly negative way to stop wholesale. It has been used to stop sort of wholesale public social housing, and it's always used as, in terms of things like proposed land development agency. Mixed tenure is assumed to be a good thing. It may not be. But to answer Hugh's question a bit more directly, I think you can end up, if we move towards the cost rental system, and that's another huge recommendation of the National Economic and Social Council, and which I think, in fairness, the City Council have been pushing for a long time as a key idea. That's the true version of mixed social cost, because it's mixed income. Mixed tenure is really a proxy for mixed income, in my mind. So I think if we move towards cost rental at serious scale, that and schemes which are really well designed and well developed, which we can do, I think we can get over that kind of very simplistic and negative view of, say, social housing. Hopefully that partially answers your question.
Okay, thank you. Mary.
Yeah, I suppose it may not be the right time to bring it in, but I would agree with that it is trying to create mixed income communities, and that it's not just about segregation, it's the stigma and the discrimination that follows on the segregation, the really lived experience. And I think there's some interesting research that even looks at how, even building design and architecture can do a lot to reduce the mono look on some of what would be seen as segregated housing. But I just particularly wanted to mention today, because the other way we see segregation happening in Ireland isn't so much in public or affordable. It's in the people who are homeless, the people who are living in congregated settings like asylum seekers, homeless families, and particularly who tend to be dominated by lone parent families. And I think the pandemic has particularly hit very hard in those groupings where they are more likely to be in congregated settings, and they're more likely to be experiencing significant overcrowding and shared facilities, which makes it very difficult to socially isolate and to do best practice guidelines in relation to pandemic health. And I just wanted to name it today because it was announced as a policy today, the development of the white paper on an own hall door strategy for asylum seekers who are living at the moment in congregated direct provision institution. Just to welcome that development, but also to argue that, hopefully it's the beginning of the realisation that congregated solutions for homeless families and for other experiencing housing difficulties really aren't the answer. I mean, we do need home all door, and that's a very welcome way of trying to avoid the most severe form of segregation that you can get, really, in terms of institutionalised congregated settings for people to live in.
Great, thank you. My colleague in Cash, Suzanne Fitzpatrick, has been great all the way through the pandemic, just pushing that this is such a clear policy outcome that we can't have congregate living anymore. It just should be consigned to the past altogether, as far as is possible. Okay, I'm going to ask another question, which is a question that again was kind of raised, and I think Manuel, you raised it, which is, the sense that OECD and other international data sets tell us that affordability is an increasingly general problem across housing markets, across the OECD set of nations. And I think there's increasing realisation of that, and certainly politicians and people in the media and the commentariat are saying more and more about it, of course, as well as the people that we all read because we are interested in housing directly. What I'd like to ask you is, what do you think should be done, what can be done, and what's probably going to be done? So what normatively would you like to see? What do you think would be the best types of solutions, and what do you actually think will happen in practice? Anybody want to respond to that provocation?
I think I already said quite a bit about these different things, so maybe let Susan go first.
Okay.
No,
okay,
I was only doing the good citizenship there. I think what is going to happen is that housing affordability is going to get worse while we don't solve the problem of land values and the management thereof. So I think that probably is what is going to happen. What will happen? What should happen is that we should be looking at ways to manage the price of rent. I mean, Manuel probably wants to take this up because you made that really good point about, there's a lot gone into making sure that homeowners are supported, with appropriate range of measures and not so much renters. So I think affordability in the rental sector is important. And I suppose the other thing that we that could be looked at, might be looked at, are also incomes, because stagnating incomes don't help with housing affordability.
No.
So.
No, indeed. Yeah, one thing we found very strongly about our wealth inequality evidence review was how many people were saying, well, actually, this is fundamentally about precarity and structural inequalities in the labour market and such like as well. Anybody else want to respond to that affordability question? Declan?
Yeah, really just to pick up on Susan's point about land, I think I'm thinking locally, what I would like to happen, and I think should happen, is clearly a huge investment, as the OECD are calling for, in social and affordable housing, and particularly cost rental, at significant scale. I think what we have been doing, we've been building some new build social housing. We've been buying stuff off developers, acquiring it, or we're leasing it, and it's a bit of a patchwork quilt in terms of how we're providing social and affordable housing. And given where we are in terms of Ireland's probably had the most spectacular boom, but also probably the most spectacular bust, we're in a bad place. This really needs to be something long term, and it reminds me of something Rory O'Donnell, the former head of National Economic Social Council, said. We do need a consensus on this, that we build social and affordable housing at scale over a long time, and particularly cost rental. And that, I think, needs, in the Irish context in particular, it needs access to public land at existing use value, or certainly very low value. So that's where I'd like to see things go. What will happen? I'm a bit more pessimistic. I mean, there is this new scheme of cost rental which was announced just before Christmas, and some housing associations are involved in that. Really good associations like Clud and Tua, and I can't remember the other one. But that's only going to produce about 350 houses, so we need to really push that. Where I am pessimistic in particular is we have a bill in front of Parliament at the moment for all the Land Development Agency bill, which had high hopes, but I think there's a couple of potential problems with it. One, I think, is that it's going to buy land, buy other public land. It's basically a land aggregator. It'll buy public land at market value, which be sometimes determined by the minister. So I think that certainly could be problematic. In terms of schemes, half 50% of schemes may be cost rental or subsidised home ownership. The rest we're presuming private. So it's unclear, for example, as to how a major scheme will be developed and risked or de-risked. And I think there's a lot of questions there. And there's also a question about affordability. It's defined so far legally as mortgage payments or rents which are below the median in a local area. Now, that sort of reminds me of going back to, say, affordability in London, where affordable rents might be 80% of market rents, but if the market rents are crazy, 80% is still unaffordable. So it's getting back to grips with that key issue of how we define affordability in this model, and the way it's defined at the moment, I think, is really problematic and won't help. So I have some glimmers of hope, but also not so optimistic in terms of this potential agency. So believe it. So not necessarily transformative, I'm afraid.
Yeah, no, that's been very, very helpful. Thanks, Declan. Manuel, do you want to come back in about the affordability issue?
I think I have little to add to what I've said before and what Susan and Declan have just said. So maybe it's better to take another question.
Okay, thanks for that. We've got about 5-6 minutes left, so this might be the last question that we all attend to. There's a question here about a specific question about Ireland, but I'm going to try and widen it out to make it more general. Which is, this is somebody asking whether urban planning has been reduced to a kind of weak form of building control with no sense of placemaking. And we've been talking about communities. We've been talking about whether we should be more reliant on zoning systems and things of that kind. But of course, there's a broader sense in which the academic planners, for instance, would talk much more about the very positive role that planning can have in how we design new communities or reimagine existing ones. So again, it's a kind of two-part question. Has urban planning, maybe in the place that you're most familiar with, has it become more about these technical matters of building control rather than about the community building, the master planning type things? And if so, what ought to be done to move things forward? So would anyone like to start with that as an issue? Declan.
I can start, given I lecture in a urban planning section. I suppose I should start. I think the potential of urban planning, properly done, is obviously huge, and there's a lot of debate about placemaking. One of the things that's happened, again, just to speak locally, is that there's been quite a lot of centralisation of planning. So we have things like apartment guidelines, height guidelines, fast track planning. All of these things have been centrally determined, and so there's been a lot. So the discretion that local authorities have and local planners have to allow or disallow schemes is much, much less. And I think that's a problem. And it goes back to something Mary said, that local authorities and local democracy, is at the bottom of the scale in European terms. So, like for example, on the fast track planning schemes, there's a huge number of high density apartment schemes have been given permission. Lots of them have very small units, studios, or 1 beds or 2 beds. So, and the local planners really have been my own view is they have been disempowered here in terms of placemaking. And all of this is decided centrally. And I think that really is problematic. The logic was get loads of permissions and hopefully developers will build. We shall see about that. So yes, loads of potential, but I think lots of risks at the moment. And I think one of my colleagues in the ECD, Dr. Alan Mee, referred to this currently as the planning, and a nice phrase, the planning and industrial complex, which I think kind of sort of encapsulates where we are with planning at the moment. So I'm a slight pessimist in that. I haven't exuded much optimism the last 2 hours. Sorry about that.
No, don't worry about that. That's not a problem. Would anybody else like to contribute to that question? If not, well, that's fine. Yeah.
I'll be the optimist to Declan's pessimist. I just remember in the mid-2000s that there was a report on Dublin City Council called Dublin, a City in Neighbourhoods. And it was that concept of urban planning and trying to imagine the community at the centre of the Dublin. And it came, I don't think it was utilised in the context of urban planning. But I do think the pandemic has been interesting in terms of placemaking being thrown upon communities and this resilience of what we see in a lot of localised communities where you're restricted to 2Ks and your 5Ks has really, I mean, I think to some degree it's fundamentally reawoken people to concepts of community making, and there's a lot to grow on and to build from there. And the other thing I think, just if we're trying to think of this urban planning, I think it's a really useful place to try and build in this infrastructure of care, or the ethic of care, as a principle into the very centre of it. And I'm not sure that has been to date, but I do think it's a way of practicalising that agenda going forward, that there is good potential there and good learning, because we've seen care in the community in a real sense now, and what it means from housing to our local infrastructures.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. Right. We've only got a couple of minutes left. I'm going to make a proposal. I'd like you all to try to reflect on, in just 30 seconds, what you think are the key takeaways for you from this afternoon. I'll go first, give you a bit more longer to think what those key takeaways might be. I would go back to what Susan said about the notion of the use value of housing and how it's been so highlighted under the pandemic. And it made me think about the innumerable housing trade conferences I've been to, where trade bodies will say things like, well, housing's now the 7th most important thing in the public's mind in a recent opinion poll. And that's also rather depressing, but clearly it is undoubtedly the case that housing has been at the core so much of the lived experience of the pandemic, that rightly or wrongly it's having this much broader impact. And I think that leads directly to these ideas of the ethics of care that Susan talks so nicely about this afternoon. So, and it also speaks, I think, to some of the policy directions that we're beginning to see. Scotland, for instance, the Scottish Government have got 20-year plans to move us towards a kind of consumption-based housing policy, where we try to get away from speculation and the excessive holding of wealth in housing, for instance. So there is a kind of tying together of these things. That's enough for me. That's just to give you some space to think about it. I'm going to start, I think, with our Irish colleagues and start with Declan, if that's okay.
Very quickly, just pick it up on, I think, one of Susan's key points is land. We need to sort out the land question, political economy of land here. Without it, in terms of being able to housing associations or local authorities being able to access cheap land, and I think we have a huge problem. So I'll finish optimistically and say that the Housing Commission is going to come up with fantastic ideas in this. So
great stuff, Declan. Thank you very much, Mary.
I guess I'm taking away the imaginary of housing. I think that's really powerful, and combined with the ethics of care and the need to see it in the context of wider public services. And like Declan, I'm going to be optimistic and argue that the pandemic, it's opened us up to some good examples of that the state can do things really well and really effectively when the political will is there. We saw that in lots of responses to banning evictions, rent increases, use of short-term accommodation for domestic violence and homelessness, better coordination, own whole door responses. So it shows to me confidence that if the political will can be garnered, that things can change and can be done. I want to take away that sense of optimism combined with a wild imagination about the possibilities. Thanks.
Excellent. Thanks very much. We'll turn to you, Manuel, next. That's okay.
Thank you very much. It's challenging to do it in 30 seconds, but I'm going to try to do it in even less. I think since we're at the RIA here today, we should think about TIA. There is an alternative. And I think the alternative is there in terms of land, planning, tax, community, tenures, and combining those things at different levels. Thanks.
Fantastic. That's excellent. Thank you very much. And that just leaves our keynote speaker, Susan, to finish us off.
Thanks very much. I agree with what everyone else has said, actually, but I was going to say the imaginary, and the thing that I was going to say about it is that, I think academics like me, we sit and think about things, and you can let your imagination go wild, and then there's a lot of practitioners and policymakers and people involved on the ground who kind of look, askance at it. And what I've sort of taken from today is actually there is a political imagination, there is an institutional imagination, and that says to me there really is an open future. So I'm going to go on with the optimists and say that I think there are real potentials and possibilities for housing to play a big part in transforming the future.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. And thank you all very much for this afternoon. I think we've had a really excellent and inspiring set of ideas and imaginaries, as you say. So thank you very much to Mary and Declan who've made this roundtable possible. Thank you, Manuel, for doing such a great job with your response, and Susan, thank you for an excellent set of provocations that got it all going. Everybody seemed to relate and respond to these things, so I'm very grateful. I'm very grateful to the RIA as well for making all this possible today, and for the people behind the scenes who've made it all happen. I found it a really interesting afternoon, a really good model, and I think the balance of the speakers worked really well. So brilliant. I think we're finishing with a short. No, don't worry. We have a short video, I think, at the very end. So thanks to all again, and I think we should hopefully move towards that video and end for the afternoon. So thanks everybody. Cheers.
Thank you, Ken. Thank you.
Thanks everyone.
Susan, thanks.